The story of the city is not just a tale of loss. It is a wound that was stitched shut with lies, a wound that still festers beneath the surface. Maps are meant to tell us where we are, but maps can also tell us what we are not allowed to see. If one city could be erased, if its people could be silenced, if its name could be swallowed whole, then what else has been taken from us without our knowledge? How many voids on our maps are not blank spaces of wilderness, but carefully hidden scars? When I think of the photograph, the faces staring unknowingly into history's furnace, I wonder if they felt it. Did they know their lives would be consumed by silence? Did they know that their streets, their homes, their laughter would be swallowed into a void so absolute that strangers like me would spend years searching for fragments of them? And yet, perhaps the most chilling thought is this: the erasure succeeded. We are speaking of a city we cannot name, a place no record will confirm. Its people are scattered shadows, its ground remains forbidden, and what lies beneath it continues to hum in silence, shielded by forests, watched over by those who never intended us to look this far. I do not know if the city's truth will ever be revealed. Perhaps it is too dangerous, too volatile, too unearthly for us to face, or perhaps it is too ordinary, too human, an atrocity committed by those in power, covered not for our safety, but for theirs. Either way, the silence holds, and every time I stare at the blank space where it should be, I feel the weight of an invisible hand pressing against history, reminding me that truth is not lost, it is hidden. So, if you ever walk through a forest where the ground feels wrong, where bricks appear beneath the roots, where roads vanish into soil and silence, ask yourself, are you standing on land that was simply forgotten? Or are you standing on the grave of a city that was never meant to be remembered? Because sometimes the most terrifying truths are not the ones we discover, they are the ones that were buried on purpose. The further I dug, the more I realized the erasure was not only about a city, it was about control, of history, of memory, of reality itself. Entire generations have lived and died never knowing that thousands of people were once erased alongside their home. And those who do know, the last descendants, live like shadows themselves, carrying a truth too heavy to speak aloud. One of them, an elderly woman, agreed to meet me in secret. Her hands shook as she unfolded a yellowed letter her mother had hidden for decades. The letter spoke of men in uniforms, unmarked, nameless, who moved through the streets at night. They collected people not randomly, but as if selecting them. Some returned, sick and delirious, unable to speak of what had been done. Others never returned at all. The letter ended abruptly, the ink blurred as if smudged by tears. If true, this was not an evacuation. It was an extraction. The city itself had been used. Its people used. And when the experiment could no longer be contained, the city was sealed, condemned, and scrubbed from existence. But the deeper horror lies in what happened next. The survivors told me of silence that followed, a silence enforced not only by fear, but by something else. Several claimed they received visits in the years after, from officials who warned them against speaking of their origins. Some were offered new homes, new identities, on the condition that they forget. Others were threatened. A few simply disappeared. And yet the woman told me what terrified her most was not the soldiers, not the warnings, but the nights. She remembers lying awake, even decades later, hearing the same low hum her mother once described, vibrating faintly through the ground, as though something beneath was still alive. That was when I began to understand. The erasure was not about the past, it was about the present. The city had been buried, not because it was gone, but because something beneath it remained, something they could not destroy, something they could only hide. And if the silence continues today, it means that whatever they buried is still there, waiting. The silence surrounding the city is not just historical, it is alive, deliberate, and still enforced. When I began pushing further, requesting documents, filing inquiries, speaking to archivists, I was met not with the indifference of bureaucracy, but with doors closing faster than they should. Requests went unanswered. Files disappeared from digital systems after I had bookmarked them. More than once, I was warned politely to redirect my research elsewhere. One archivist, her voice trembling, told me, "Don't you understand? This is not history. This is an ongoing order." That sentence chilled me. If this erasure was still active, it meant there were those alive today whose job was to ensure the city's memory never returned. But who and why? It was then that the pattern began to reveal itself. Hidden in obscure land records, I discovered parcels marked as government property, restricted access, every one of them aligned with the land where the city should have been. And buried in technical notes, I found the mention of subsurface monitoring. No explanation, no context, just that, monitoring something beneath the ground. I tried to reach the site myself. What I found was a forest, dense and unwelcoming. The air was unnaturally still, the kind of stillness that feels imposed rather than natural. And scattered among the trees were fragments, bricks half buried, a warped iron gate leading to nothing, the outline of a road vanishing into roots and moss. But more disturbing than the ruins were the signs. Weather-worn but still legible. "Do not enter. Hazardous area. Trespassers will be prosecuted." Who puts up hazard signs in a place that supposedly never existed? And then came the most unsettling discovery. Buried in testimony after testimony was the same cryptic warning passed down like a curse. The city is not gone, it is only hidden, and what sleeps beneath must rise. Main buried. If you're still here, you've already crossed the threshold most fear to enter. Tell me, would you dare to uncover this truth if it was buried in your own hometown? Would you risk peeling back the silence, knowing that what you find might change the way you see every street, every building, every familiar corner you thought you understood? Because the truth is this: if one city can be erased, so can any other. Erasure is not an act of the past, it is a weapon of the present. The photograph became my anchor, the single thread in a tapestry that someone had tried to rip apart. With it in hand, I began cross-referencing architectural styles, comparing roof lines, street widths, the very shape of the windows. It was not like any known settlement in the region, too uniform, too deliberate, as though the city had been planned for a purpose beyond ordinary life. That raised a darker possibility. What if this was never meant to be an ordinary city at all? What if it was built for an experiment, one that had to be buried when it went wrong? I reached out to a historian who specialized in clandestine settlements, places constructed by governments for projects the public was never meant to see. He spoke of towns that existed only to serve weapons testing or biological research or classified industries. Some were decommissioned quietly, their populations relocated under false pretenses. Others were hidden so thoroughly that not even their workers knew the truth of where they lived. He listened to my description, studied the photograph, and then his voice dropped low. "If your city was erased," he said, "it was not because of what it was. It was because of what happened there." That statement haunted me. It suggested catastrophe, not natural but human, something engineered, then concealed. I revisited the testimonies, this time with sharper ears. The sicknesses, the disappearances, the soldiers, the warnings of contamination. Piece by piece they began to sound less like fragments of rumor and more like the residue of a cover-up. And yet, one detail disturbed me more than all the rest. Several survivors spoke of hearing sounds at night before the soldiers came, not gunfire, not riots, but a low, humming vibration, like machinery buried deep beneath the earth. One woman described it as though the ground itself was alive, pulsing with something unnatural. Days later, people began to fall ill. Strange rashes, fevers that burned through entire households, hallucinations of figures standing at their doors when no one was there. What kind of machine hums beneath a city? What kind of experiment leaves behind sickness without cure, a contamination without name? The historian would not speak further. His hands trembled as he folded the photograph back toward me, refusing to keep it in his possession. "Some truths," he whispered, "are erased for a reason." But if the city was erased to hide a catastrophe, then why did the survivors still fear its memory? Why, even decades later, do they lower their voices and look to the shadows before speaking its name? There is a difference between forgetting and erasing. Forgetting is natural. Time wears away memory, leaving behind only fragments. But erasure, that is an act of will. It requires planning, resources, authority. Someone had to decide that this city would not simply fall but vanish, and someone had to ensure that its very absence would not raise suspicion. I began tracing railway lines because trains do not lie. Old maps showed a route that cut through farmland, rivers, forests, and then, in one particular stretch, the tracks simply stopped. A dead end in the middle of nowhere, where every logical extension should have connected to a settlement. I traveled there myself. The rails were rusted, overtaken by weeds, but the earth told a different story. Beneath layers of moss and decay, there was evidence that trains had once traveled far beyond the recorded terminus. The steel had been cut, clean, as if someone wanted no one to see where it had once led. In the villages nearby, I found a few who remembered. They spoke with caution, often glancing over their shoulders, as though someone unseen might punish them for sharing too much. An old man described watching, as a boy, an entire column of smoke rise from the horizon where the city once stood. He said it lasted for days, black and heavy, and no one was allowed to approach. Another woman claimed she remembered soldiers posting signs in the countryside, warning of contamination. When pressed, she could not describe what kind. Disease, radiation, or something worse. She only shook her head, repeating the same phrase. It was not safe to remember. The deeper I searched, the more contradictions surfaced. Some documents hinted at an industrial accident, yet the dates did not match. Others suggested an outbreak, but there were no medical records of quarantines, no reports of treatment centers, a disaster without survivors. Without burial grounds, without monuments, even tragedies leave scars. This one left nothing, and yet, buried in one forgotten archive, misfiled among unrelated papers, I found a photograph, grainy, blurred, taken perhaps in haste. It showed rows of houses, narrow streets, and faces staring toward the camera, unaware that their existence would soon be erased. The image had no caption, no location, only a date. But it was enough, proof that the city had lived. The realization sank into me like ice. If one photograph survived by accident, how many others had been destroyed intentionally? The first time I heard about the city, it came from a man whose eyes never stayed still. He spoke in fragments, the way someone does when fear still lives inside their bones. He told me his grandmother was born there, in a city that doesn't exist, a city that was erased before he himself came into the world. She never spoke of it openly, only in hushed tones when the lamps were low, as if the darkness itself might betray her words to listening ears. She described streets paved in uneven stone, lined with tall, narrow houses. She said the city had a central square where children once played, where bells rang every morning, and where voices rose in unison during markets and festivals. There were schools, churches, workshops, life, in every sense of the word, and yet there was also a presence. Something about the place was wrong, she said, not in the way of superstition, but in the way shadows sometimes fall where no light should cast them. The people whispered of accidents, of sudden sicknesses that spread through families, of disappearances no one dared to question. And then, one year, everything stopped. The bells no longer rang, the markets were emptied. Soldiers, he didn't know from where, arrived in the dead of night, and within days, the city was sealed off. Families were torn apart, some fleeing into the forests, others taken away in trucks whose insignias no one recognized. What followed was not war nor disaster, but something quieter, more chilling. Buildings were demolished with no explanation. Streets were buried under heaps of soil and rubble. The very name of the place was struck from records. And those who survived were told, "You never lived there. That place never existed." For years, the man's grandmother carried the secret in silence, but old age weakens the will to obey fear. She told him of the city's name, though even he trembled when repeating it, to me. And when I tried to verify, I found nothing, not in libraries, not in archives, not even in the oldest maps where one might expect at least a trace. A void had replaced the truth. Yet here's what struck me most. When I cross-referenced other testimonies, I found the same silence, but also the same tremor in the voices of those few who remembered. It was as if they were all describing a ghost, one that had been deliberately starved of its body. The question that haunted me was this: why? What threat does a city pose that demands not only its destruction, but its erasure? They say history is written by the victors, but what happens to the places where even the victors refuse to leave their mark? Imagine a city that existed not in rumor, not in legend, but in plain reality. A city where people lived, breathed, built families, and carved their names into the earth. And yet, today, you will not find it on any map. Its roads lead to nothing. Its name has been struck from records, and even the soil where it once stood has been left to rot beneath forests that were never meant to grow there. If you search, you will find only silence. Silence, and fragments of whispers carried down through those who dared to remember what they were told to forget. But why erase a city? Was it a punishment? A cover-up? Or something so devastating, so unbearable, that the only way to protect the rest of us was to remove its existence altogether? I spent years chasing this story. Every official archive I touched gave me the same answer. No such city ever existed. Every government record showed blank spaces, missing census reports, property deeds burned or misfiled, train lines that suddenly ended in the middle of nowhere. It was as though the ground itself had swallowed every trace of human presence. And yet, the ground speaks in ways paper never can. Old foundations still hide beneath the earth, stones where houses once stood, corroded water pipes feeding nothing but roots. I spoke to men who swore they had grandparents born in this place, women who said their mothers once walked its streets. They all carried the same haunted look when they said the name aloud, as though even speaking it was an act of rebellion against something vast and merciless and watching. This is not the story of a forgotten city. This is the story of a city that was deliberately erased, a city condemned not only to die, but to be wiped clean from the memory of humankind. Tonight, you will hear what few have dared to repeat, because if you follow this trail long enough, you may discover that this is not about one lost city at all. It may be about every city, every nation, every map we trust to tell us where we live and where we are allowed to exist.